llamas. I am a strong believer that it's more helpful to learn this stuff by doing it. So the structure of the workshop is I sent a judge test around a week ago. So we're going to go through it, and I'll use the questions as a starting point to then try to deconstruct the theory of, look, the answer works in the following way. Why? Because of these reasons. Can I share my screen? Yes, I can. Okay, cool. Okay, so let's share the judge test. This is the judge test from Euros 2019 in Athens. Okay, screen share. Good. Okay, cool. Can you see my screen? All right, good. So, judge test. Question number 1. Does the top room have the best speakers in the tournament? The top room of the tournament should cumulatively have the highest speaker point in the tournament. True or false? Volunteers.
I think it's false.
Yep. Why?
Because the tabby only computes the points and not the speaker points.
Right. So the way that this response works is it's basically testing bias. So there is no intrinsic reason why the fact that just because a debate happened in the top room, it has to be a good debate. So it's perfectly possible that the debate that happens in the top room is extremely bad and that the speaker points are very poor. So basically what this question is testing is whether you are biased in favor of thinking that just because a debate happened in a top room, it has to be a good debate. That's not necessarily true. And this works as an excuse for just having a very general chat on how speaker points work. Speaker points are a bit weird because they are both cardinal and ordinal rankings. Why? Because obviously you use speaker points to decide who's better than another team, but you're also doing an additional thing with speaker points, which is that you're also trying to compare speakers to some sort of absolute standard. So when you're doing speaker points, you can just stick to a comparison of, look, I think that the speaker was better than everyone else, therefore they should have very high speaks. That's not necessarily true. And it's also not necessarily true that if a speaker was significantly worse than everyone, they need to have low speaks. And for example, this is a problem that I've seen with some inexperienced judges, which is that they often think that just because a team clearly lost a debate, they necessarily need to have low speaker points. It's perfectly possible that there is a debate in which 3 teams were great and they had extremely high speaker points. And then there is another team that clearly took the 4th, but was still reasonably good. So like you have 3 teams scoring 85s and 87s, and then the 4th team gets 81s. It does happen, it could happen. So once again, keep in mind that speaker points are comparative in the sense that obviously the team that wins needs to have more speaker points than the team that gets 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. But still, speaker points are also a comparison to an absolute standard. So just the fact that someone loses does not mean that speaks need to be low. Just the fact that they win does not require speaks to be high. Anyway, question number 2. An opening government that do not have a model on a policy motion cannot win. True or false? Volunteers.
I have a question before that.
Yep.
I was typing it, but like I really have a problem with speaker points because if a debater like single-handedly wins the debate by himself in a single speech, and my partner or his partner just gets up and say, "Oh, my partner just won the debate, and I don't think I have anything else to say." So that's it. Like just a 15 seconds speech. What happens?
Right. So I actually think that this is very helpful for understanding how speaks work. So speaks are not previous to the result what speaker points do is that they are a way for you to try to represent the result in numbers. So let's think about this hypothetical case in which you have one team that basically only consists of one speech. So like, for example, let's say that this team is opening government. There is a prime minister speech and then DPM does not say anything. In that case, the only conceivable way in which the opening government could win without the DPM saying a single thing is that the prime minister's speech was brilliant. Because if that was not the case, then it is very likely, for example, that a team that does not respond to a single point brought by the leader of the opposition is probably going to lose. So like if a prime minister said some things and then those things got responded to, and then DPM does not say anything, it is likely that they will lose if they make no effort to even engage the other three teams in the debate. However, it could happen that after a considered reflection, you think that they still won, even though the deputy prime minister did not say anything. But the only way in which you could reach that conclusion is because you think that the prime minister's speech was brilliant or was like enormously better than the speeches from the other speakers. So like, for example, say, you think that the prime ministers won the round even though their partner got a 50. So the only way in which that would be, say, mathematically possible is if the prime minister got, say, 95 and then the other teams got 60 something. Once again, what I'm saying is your speaker points are a representation of the considered judgment that you reach. It's not that you base the call on how you think the speaker points add up. Is that the speaker points are representing how you perceive a debate. So being realistic about this case, the only way in which a team could win with essentially one speech is that the one person who actually spoke did a great job, but also, very likely, the other teams that did have two speeches were pretty weak, because that's most likely the only way in which you could beat three teams that had two speeches with only one speech. So yeah, did that work? Yes? Okay. Number two, an opening government that do not have a model on a policy motion cannot win. Any thoughts on this?
That's false.
Yep. Why?
I think it harms a little bit the opening government to not have a model in a policy motion, but it's not a like. It's like it doesn't really mean that they are going to lose just because they don't have a model, because the other teams can do much worse than them.
Exactly.
So it's just like a flawed case.
Correct. Yeah. So roughly speaking, I think a useful metaphor here, and this is an excuse for, I think, separating two crucial things that are often mistaken for judging. I think a metaphor that works here is a metaphor with football, or what some Americans annoyingly call soccer. In football, there is one thing called the rules, which is the set of constraints that players must follow. But while following the rules is a necessary condition for winning a football match, it is not a sufficient condition for winning a football match. So it's not that at the end of the day, they ask, why did Brazil win that match against Peru, which they always win? It's not, they won because they followed the rules. No, they won because they scored goals. So I think one way of seeing this is the rules work as a set of constraints that teams often must follow, but it's not that they win or lose because of the rules. So, for example, it is something that's expected from the opening government that they present a policy if the motion requires a policy. But it is not true that they would win a debate just by having a policy, and it is also not true that they would lose it just by not having it. So like teams do not win or lose rounds just because they follow the rules better than the other teams. It does mean that there are cases in which you have, say, to evaluate whether a particular move or a particular point was legitimate, you will have to consult the rules, which is like if in a football match, a player scores a goal with their hand, you would not say that that is a legitimate goal. A similar thing happens in debating. So, for example, if the opposition whip brings 5 brilliant new arguments, you cannot count them. So what it means is that the rules constrain, limit to some extent the different moves that teams can make, but by themselves, they do not determine whether a team loses or wins. And I think that that's also the crux of question number 3. Question number 3 is CG can place over OG, even if government whips spent all of their time summing up OG's case. In that case, it is true. Why? Once again, it is expected from the government whip that they will also respond to the closing opposition, and that they will whip the case of their member. But once again, just because the government whip did something that's not advisable by the rules, it does not mean that they will automatically lose. Because once again, as we saw also in the question that was asked at first, it is possible that the member of government was really good and that they could just win with that speech. And I think that, so to use this as say as an excuse to make a distinction, I think we should differentiate 3 things. One thing is whether a team won the key clashes of a debate. Obviously, the question of what counts as a key clash is something that we will discuss further. But one thing is whether you think that the arguments that a team made were overall capable of defeating the most crucial subset of points that the other teams made. That is one thing. A second thing is whether you think that the teams correctly follow the things that are expected from their speaker roles at every moment. And very often following that makes it easier for them to win, or discounts that could have been used by them to win if they had followed those rules. So like, for example, if a team brings 5 brilliant points, they could have won. So like the rules are say things that constrain or enhance the capacity of teams to make persuasive points that defeat the other teams. But that's not necessarily the same current issue in more inexperienced judges, that they say things like, well, I think that they won this debate because they did a good job at setting up a model, or that they extended really well. Yeah, just following a role or not following it is not the same as making points that are more persuasive than the other team. And then I think a third thing that we should differentiate is like, one thing is the arguments and how they clash. A second thing are the rules of the format. And then a third thing is what you would advise speakers to do. To continue the metaphor with football, there is a set of tips that a coach can give to a player. But once again, that's not why. I think that one mistake that judges often make is that they confuse the fact that something is advisable with the fact that something makes you win or lose a debate. For example, being structured and say having a clear outline of your case is advisable because it means that it will be easier for judges to follow your points. But it does not mean that just because your case was very clear and your structure was very good, you will win. And kinds of questions should not factor in the process of deciding who won. Or like, I don't know. So basically issues of clarity, issues of like how they divide their points, whether they are explicitly flagging what they will say. Those may be recommendable things that if you're coaching someone, you say, look, I would recommend that you structure your case in the following way. But the fact that you think something would help them does not mean that that speakers themselves can prep and train before a round. If you think that is the case, then that's probably not the reason why they won a debate. Because the reason why they won a debate is internal to the particular clashes and arguments that came up during that round. Like, there are no generic reasons for winning, like you were very clear, so you won. That doesn't make any sense. All right. Question number 4 doesn't matter. Question number 5. So the team that wins most of the clashes should always win the debate. Obviously, the answer here is no. As we have discussed a couple minutes ago, the key question here is which team wins the most crucial clashes of the debate. So like, I don't know, imagine that motion is this house would invade Somalia, and there are 3 clashes: whether this kills everyone in Somalia, whether this makes racist people really happy, and whether this is really good for people who sell weapons. Probably the first clash is more important than the second and the third, quite obviously. So the fact that you win 2 clashes does not mean that you win one particular round. Or say, even if one team wins the vast majority of things the teams said in a debate, does not necessarily mean that they will win that debate. So one question here is, okay, how do you determine what matters? Brenda, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I also have a question on clashes. Like when the teams are uncomparative, like they don't explain how relevant their clashes are, I have a bit of trouble drawing the line and what is like admitting that a certain clash is more intuitive and that team has won for that reason, and having the feeling that I am somehow completing their argument.
Right. So the correct answer to this is that there is no answer. So so basically, I think you should ask a hierarchical set of 3 questions. The first is to look for implicit agreement between teams. And I think that's something that happens very often is they will not explicitly say, what we care the most in this debate is X. And it rarely happens that the opposition says, we agree with the opening government that X is what matters the most. So we will base everything on X. No, but I think that very often you can implicitly track those concessions. Like, for example, something like most of their arguments or like all of their claims presuppose that it is good to achieve more equality. So whether you feel convinced that one team actually gets more equality in society is a criteria that you use because you actually track that. It seems that the claims that they are making are presupposing that specific value. That's one thing, which is to just try to look if they implicitly are presupposing one criteria in the things they say. So I think that's the first thing to look at. The second thing, though, is very often there will be no agreement. And in that case, I think you should just defer to which team explains to some extent why something matters more than the subset of claims made by the other team. And in the case that you're positing, which is fine, the debate was a complete disaster and nobody really explained why is it that we should care about the subset of claims that they make. In that case, on to the criteria of the global informed citizen. Now, what is the global informed that is? So like, it's just a very vague and generic term, which means intuitions that are shared by most informed people around the world, which obviously is not very informative. So just to give you a broad idea, the fact that it's good to have freedom and it's bad to be a victim of oppression, the fact that it's better for people to live than for people to die, the fact that it would be nice if we had less people suffering. But obviously, I think there is a lot of subjectivity here. And there is also a degree of arbitrariness. So like, why do we agree that the intuitions of the global informed citizen lean towards, I don't know, feeling sympathy towards those who are deprived rather than, I don't know, embracing like
Guys,
which are things such as people not dying and being in pain. So we will privilege those claims. But once again, precisely because of how subjective and nebulous this is, it should be the last resort. So like, you should not try to defer to this very vague criteria unless it's absolutely necessary. But if you have to, you have to. And it often happens with an experienced teams that this is the only thing that you can do. Yes.
I have like some problems with clashes as well, because sometimes I feel that some arguments they accept some premise that's not entirely true, like especially in debates like what we should do about Muslim people or Islamic people. Sometimes like we have these assumptions that, oh, if we do this, terrorism will go, like terrorist number will go up and we'll have like a lot of lone wolf attacks. And like I have a problem drawing the line of what is being like informed and what is accepting some kind of assumptions that just look like they are false. Because if you really think, like, does the average citizen knows what is like on the Eastern world, or they have the assumptions of a NY Times reader or something like that? Like, where should I draw the line? And how do I evaluate these arguments and these impacts? Like,
it's a tricky question. So the first thing I would say is the most common standard is whether you think that this is something that would be a major story in international news. So once again, there are a couple of ambiguous points. One, what is a major story? Well, presumably something that gets a lot of coverage and that gets like on front covers. Secondly, what is international news? Well, debatable, I would say, but to some extent outlets such as BBC, but also things like Al Jazeera and El País maybe. But once again, it's not a lot. So like, it's just major issues. So like, it's not like if you think that it would be reasonable for this to be featured in an opinion article in page 57 of Al Jazeera, then this is something that you can presuppose. No, it's just like, if you think that this would be a major issue reported by a credible and important news agency, then you can presuppose it. But you should err on the side of not assuming too many things. And I do think that it is a structural thing that happens in debating, that the amount of things that we are asked to assume is not the same for every region in the world. So, for example, we often get debates about the internal functioning of politics in the United States, and we would never get a motion about the internal functioning of the politics of Peru. We just wouldn't. And one way to justify that is it seems that there are some countries that are featured more in international news than others, and not just feature more, say, within those regions. So it's not like, CNN talks more about the United States, therefore we should talk more about the United States. But if you check any newspaper from any region, it seems like the United States is more prominent than Vanuatu. So again, it's a nebulous criteria, but for example, it is very common to assume a bit more knowledge on China, the United States, Germany. So basically, countries that you think have a significant chance of impacting the development of global geopolitics, and it's less likely. So like the amount of knowledge that you can presuppose will probably go down the less international clout that a country has. Yeah. Okay. 6. If CO's rebuttal beats all of OG's arguments, that should be taken into account when deciding between OG and the opening opposition. True or false?
I think that this one is false.
Yep. Why? Any thoughts here?
It's because when you're making a comparison between two teams, you should only take into account the answers those two teams provided to each other's cases and not additional responses made by other teams, right?
Oh, you're muted.
Oops. Okay. Yeah. So good. Yeah. So basic thing on judging, when you are discussing two teams, you can only talk about those two teams. And like, for example, this is a common mistake that we make, which is that, for example, clash between OG and opening opposition. And then Winks start mentioning, well, I thought that OG was very bad because CG said the crucial things in the round and OG didn't. It is like, you're not being asked to compare OG and CG. So comparisons are only pairwise, and you should only stick to those comparisons. There is one exception, which is when comparing whether you think a team was derivative. So for example, if I am comparing CG versus CO, it will matter whether I think that CG was derivative of the opening government. Because if I think that the closing government was derivative of the opening government, therefore the contributions that they brought to the debate are not substantial, and it means that they are not defeating the closing opposition because they are not really bringing material on their own, but rather they are just repeating the material of the opening government. So like, for example, I think a classic case of poor judging is the opening government runs a very good case. Then the closing government repeats the case from the opening government, and then the closing opposition makes a relatively weak case. And your conclusion is, look, when I compare closing government versus closing opposition, it seems that closing government said more persuasive things than closing opposition, so they beat them, but those things are basically repetitions of the opening government, so they lose against the opening government. Yeah, that's not how it works. So that's the only case in which a comparison with a third team matters within a pairwise comparison. Otherwise, you should not do it. Okay. Yeah, all right. So 7, obviously false. Not all arguments are equal. Some arguments are easier to prove than others. Therefore, teams that choose to run original and interesting arguments should have an increased chance of winning. Yeah, I don't think that nobody is consciously doing this. So like, I don't think that any, well, maybe some, But like, I don't think that most judges would consciously say this. But it does happen that there is a bias in favor of claims that are interesting, which makes sense because judging is often very painful and boring unless they are giving you money. So it often happens that judges reward points just for the sake of those points being creative. You should not do it. So the fact that something is exciting or new, or that, I didn't think of this argument, does not necessarily mean that they win. So you should always assess them under the same criteria, which is, do I think that this team provided me better reasons for thinking that this is true and that this is important? And other additional criteria such as interestingness, creativeness does not really matter. Creativity. All right. Okay, 8. The relevance of non-consequentialist arguments rise according to the type of motion. On analysis motions, which are not about implementing policies, non-consequentialist arguments should be considered the most important arguments in the debate, because analysis motions are not really about practical consequences. Any thoughts on this? Yeah.
I really don't know, but I think that this one is false because the
Right.
practical consequences matters, maybe not that much as the others, but they matter, and depends on what is the construction of the argument. I think that is.
Right, yeah. So I think one way to picture this is, what is a practical argument? And actually a practical argument is not that distinct from a principal claim. So for example, a principal claim would be, this policy makes people unfree, we value freedom, therefore this is bad. A practical argument is, for example, let's say in a motion about increasing the minimum wage. Increasing the minimum wage increases unemployment. Unemployment is bad. Therefore, we think that this should not be done. But there is one hidden set of assumptions within the claim unemployment is bad. So like, why is it that you think unemployment is bad? Like, is it just because like you think it is intrinsically rewarding for people to work as transportation department bureaucrats 12 hours a day? No, it's presumably because you think that that unemployment leads to a decrease of living standards and therefore causes unnecessary suffering. So like, we would rather have a world in which people have a job, because a world in which people have a job is a world in which less people will live in poverty, and a world with less poverty is a world with less suffering. So ultimately, practical claims are also based on a principle like a big family of philosophical positions known as consequentialism, which is that we value things like happiness and pleasure and well-being, and we want to prevent things like pain and illness and death. So there is actually not a clear distinction here. So like, for example, if in an analysis motion, it makes sense to say this is bad because it leads to a loss of freedom, it also makes sense to say this is bad because it leads to lots of people suffering. Why? Because ultimately, it is a legitimate claim to say that you care about a principle, and this principle is that people should not suffer. And in many cases, you can say that a particular type of world leads to suffering. So for example, I don't know if you've read Brave New World. Brave New World is like this story about like a dystopian society where people are like pre-programmed genetically to follow a strict subset of social roles. So there was a motion, which was the open semifinal for Thai Worlds in 2020, which was something like, this house prefers a world, this house would rather live in a brave new world than live in a Western liberal democracy. So that motion obviously is not a policy motion. So we are not saying we will implement a public policy that will force people to live like in Brave New World. We're just being asked to analyze which of those two worlds is better. So it's not a policy motion, but the consequences still matter greatly in terms of whether this makes people suffer, whether those lives would be worth living, whether it would be enjoyable to like be a member of that society, whether you think that such a society is likely to have, I don't know, a higher rate of suicide, whether that society is likely to have violence. So all of those questions, I think, are consequentialist questions because they are based on a principle that we want to reduce suffering in the world, but this still applies and it is a key part of a motion that's about analyzing two worlds and not a policy motion. So the answer is no. It doesn't matter which type of motion you are debating. Questions of consequences and questions of principles are both important, and the reason why they are why they both matter is precisely because they are actually not that distinct. And also, like, the opposite happens. So, like, for example, let's think about this case. One second. Let's think of a good example. All right, yeah. So let's say that the motion, once again, is this house would raise the minimum wage, and the opposition says this is really bad in terms of freedom, because when unemployment goes up, people have less money to spend, and money allows you to exercise your freedom of choice, because as a consumer, you can make a number of decisions over the type of life that you want to live. And when you are faced with poverty, you are less free because you now do not have that that additional layer of things that allow you to exercise, say, your autonomy in society. This is a principled claim. Not really. Why? Because it is hung, it depends on the claim that unemployment will go up. If the opening government says, no, unemployment will not go up, and they bring like some sort of a Keynesian case that no, because now people can spend more money, so like they stimulate businesses more and you can hire more people, therefore unemployment will not go up. That is a practical point, but it brings down the apparently principled claim by the opening opposition. Why? Because it's a principle that relies on a practical outcome happening, which is people will have less freedom because they will have less money, and they will have less money because they will not have a job. If the opening government convinces me that it is not true, that they will not have a job, therefore, this practical claim brings down a principal claim. So once again, my suggestion here is don't try to distinguish the principle from the practical as to like sharply different things, and that like one subset of things matters more for one motion and then the other doesn't, because actually I think they are relatively similar arguments based on a relatively similar set of assumptions, and they are usually counted in a relatively similar number of ways. Yeah, so there are some questions here. Yeah, I don't know, anyone?
Maybe I can start then, thank you. One common concern here in Brazil has to do with the difference between some types of policy motions and motions which are, well, analysis motions, but they do tend to behave somewhat similarly to practice motions. So, for example, this house believes X should be implemented, tends to behave somewhat similar to this house would implement X. When people ask me about this, one thing that comes to my mind is that when you have a proper policy motion, the government has a fiat, so I guess more power in order to do stuff like resources, money, political capital, time, and so on. And also, of course, the opposition has the counter fiat. And this power to make a model, let's say like this, is not as present in analysis motions. I guess this is the main difference that comes to my mind. But any other things we should pay attention to when judging, for example?
Right. So my response here is it causes ambiguity, and that's why most CA teams are very conscious to avoid those ambiguous wordings. So like, for example, you could say, this house believes that the United States should create a, should designate a special state to be ruled by African Americans. Or you can say, this house would designate blah, blah, blah. I think in most cases, CA teams will be very cautious to avoid those ambiguities with language. And that's why more often than not, motions of analysis are distinguished from motions about a particular policy with a very clear language. So for example, it may be phrased in terms of a world. This house would prefer a world in which X happens, or like this house, yeah, so like there are some cases in which the phrasing may be ambiguous, but more often than not, there are strategies for trying to prevent this from happening. So it is more likely than not that this will not be an issue of your concern. However, if it happens, I think that the correct thing is to just treat them like policy motions if the suggestion is a particular policy. So if it is, this house believes that we should do X, that should be interpreted as a policy motion. If it is a policy, like this house would, like this house believes that we should adopt conscription, I think we should give a similar reading as this house would adopt conscription. Actually, this is the reason why this is especially confusing is that there are different circuits, especially in the Australasian circuit, in which the usual way of phrasing policy motions is with should. So like that we should do X. So it is an issue that could bring concern. My suggestion is try to not make it happen. And if it happens, treat it like a policy motion, especially like in an international context, right? So it may be that different limited local circuits treat it in different ways. But my suggestion is that if this is a major international competition, that you treat it like a policy motion. There were two other questions, right? No? Okay. Okay, cool. All right. 9, which also works for motion types. Yeah. This house, as the US, would cease the trade war with China. A non-consequentialist argument has no value, as we are asking what serves the interest of an actor best. Thoughts on this question?
That is true.
No, it's false. So the reason why this motion is false, the reason why this question is false is for the following reason. Motions that ask you to evaluate something from the point of view of an actor should be perceived as if you were that person, or say that institution, what are the things that you would take into account when making that decision? So like, for example, let's think about me, Sebastian Dasso, and you ask me, would you like to own a ranch of llamas? There are a bunch of considerations that I may take into account. Some considerations will be practical, such as whether it is financially a good idea, or whether I think I have sufficient talent to attract tourists to come to my ranch. But it is also true that when I am making decisions, I take into account my moral values. So like, for example, let's say that I am a radical advocate for the liberation of animals. And I say, no, I think that having a llama ranch would be immoral because I think that llamas should be free. Therefore, when I am making a decision to do something, I take into account the things that matter to me. And the things that matter to me are sometimes practical, but they are also sometimes principled. So I think that there's a confusion that often happens in motions about, say, this house as the Pope would do X, which is that they say, the Pope is this like Machiavellian bastard that only cares about maximizing the profit of the Catholic Church, or like maximizing the political clout of the Catholic Church. Yeah, that's probably not true. Like, I don't know the Pope personally, but I think it's more likely than not that he also cares about his moral values. So like, it is perfectly valid to say actor X follows this principle, and according to this principle, the action that's being suggested by the motion is bad. Therefore, we think it would be a good idea for this actor to not do it, because the things that this actor cares about include moral values. So like, for example, in a motion about the United States, you could say that the United States institutionally and historically is committed to a number of principles, arguably democracy, highly arguable, but you could say we think that the United States has a principled commitment to democracy and free speech and blah, blah, blah. Therefore, they have a principled duty to act in this following manner. Therefore, as the United States, we think it would be a good idea to do X. Now, there is obviously a tricky question here, which is fine, but where to draw the line? So can I say that the Pope should support abortion because abortion is moral and the Pope cares about morality? No. Why? Because I should presuppose the values of that particular actor, not my own values, or not the values of the average intelligent voter, or not, say, the values of most people. What I should presuppose and take into account are the specific values of that person. Why? Because once again, the way to interpret a motion about a particular subset of actors is what are the considerations that they would take into account when they are making a decision. And some of those considerations are moral, but obviously they refer to their own values, not to, say, the values of the average intelligent voter or the global informed citizen. So also, I think one distinction that's useful to point out is that it is very different to say this house as the US would cease the trade war with China with saying this house believes that the US should cease the trade war with China. Why? Because in case number one, obviously, I am presupposing a subset of concerns that the United States has from the perspective of the United States. And in the latter, I am not doing that. I am trying to evaluate whether that is a good idea from a neutral standpoint. So like in that case, it would make sense, say, to to mention values that are not necessarily followed by the United States. So like, I don't know, to give an example, we believe that it is a good idea for the United States to withdraw from Afghanistan because it means that less Afghani civilians will die. Do we think that the values of the United States lean them towards deeply caring about the lives of civilians in the Middle East? Maybe not. I won't take a stand on this, but it doesn't matter because if the motion is phrased as this House believes that the United States should X, it doesn't really matter because you evaluate this from a arguments. The speaker must flag this to judges, and if they do not, it should not be counted as rebuttal. This is false. The following reason for this specific thing must flag this to judges. This is extreme. Have a meta look at how BP judging works. So I'm not very knowledgeable about other debating for like a BP judge is not a passive judge. It's a very active judge. So like, it's not that you should only associate points or connect points if teams specifically make the connection, or that you should say only credit one thing as responding to a claim if they specifically say, and this responds to the argument about X. No. So very often what will happen is that teams will just say things and they will not really tell you what that thing is doing in the debate. And it will be your job as a judge to try to reconstruct how the different things that teams said are engaging with one another. And some of those interactions will be implicit. So like perhaps they are not specifically responding to the claim of one team, but they're saying a different thing that by extension also responds to that claim. And that's why judging BP is not particularly easy, but it is a challenge that you must embrace if you want to keep doing it, which is you have to work really hard at trying to see how is it that claims are interacting, even when teams don't tell you how they interact. All right. Yes.
So about the last question, because for me, I had a problem, but like if if a team show arguments about the interest of an actor, but like it's not like the best arguments, and the other team show more consequential arguments, like how we evaluate this.
Right. I think this will basically be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. But let's try to construct an example. So the motion is, say, this House, as the United States, would end the war on drugs. The opening government says, look, it would be a good idea to end the war. Then the opening opposition does not engage with this. And they only say in 25 seconds, no, because the United States is a Christian nation and drugs, or this is against the values of the United States. We're a team in this debate that talk about the values of the United States explicitly, therefore we win. Yeah. In that case, the opening opposition would not win against the opening government. Because once again, we have to tell you why is it that the actor is, or why the actor should care about this. It would definitely help. It is highly advisable, but it doesn't mean that if a team does not explicitly flag, and the reason why the United States cares about this is because X, Y, Z. It depends. But there are more contentious cases in which they might lose because they didn't explain that. So, for example, I don't know, say this house would end the war on drugs, and they explain why is it that this would be really good for, I don't know, the electronic music industry, because now people will have a lot of creativity induced by magic mushrooms. In that case, it is deeply unclear why the United States cares about that particular thing happening. So in that case, teams would be very harmed by not explaining that, because it is very difficult or essentially not possible to make the association of why is it that the actor discussing the motion cares about this particular thing. In those cases, I do think it would be safe to say a team that runs a case based on consequences that are unclear why the actor would care about and does not explain why the actor would care about those things, would probably explicitly say an actor cares about these things, they will necessarily lose. Because there are some cases in which it will be implicit that, look, obviously they do not want a nuclear war. Obviously, they do not want their own people to die. Obviously, they do not want a civil war, and so on. So it depends. Okay. 11, you are watching a debate where opening opposition are clearly beating opening government. Closing government provide compelling rebuttal to OO's case, but they essentially repeat OJ's arguments in their constructive material. CO say CG has no extension. Closing opposition is correct. Thoughts on this?
I think
Well,
it's false.
Why?
Because rebuttal is also constructive material.
Right, correct. So like, I think the correct way to take a look at this is the contributions that teams make are anything that helps them to win a number of clashes in the debate. And there is actually no meaningful distinction between constructive arguments and the rebuttals that you give. Because, well, basically, if the opposition whip brings brilliant rebuttals that were not mentioned by the member of the opposition, the answer is yes. It is unlikely, like it would have to be very good, but it is possible. So once again, why? Because when we try to make comparisons between teams, what we essentially want to look is, did they provide us with reasons for thinking that one subset of claims is more persuasive than another subset of claims, and rebutting the claims from the other side decisively obviously is a contribution towards that goal. So a team may perfectly win just by systematically bringing down the case of a different team. It is plausible. All right. Yeah, 12, not important. Yeah, all right. 13 is basically a question of the criteria of the global informed citizen. So like basically don't do that. That question is obviously false. Okay, 14 is also false. So the fact that a claim is technical does not mean that you should discount it. It just means the teams have to explain it. So it means that you cannot presuppose it. So for example, I cannot presuppose highly technical knowledge about how the oil industry of Qatar works. But if a team wants to explain that and they illustrate me reasons that any person without background on that matter can grasp, then obviously I should credit that point. So when we talk about specialized knowledge, the only thing that we're talking about is the things that you can take for granted. Obviously, you can also mention things that would constitute specialized knowledge, but with the condition that you explain those things. Okay, 15. No, not important. The debate outside the house. All right, yeah. 16, obviously false. Why? It is not mandatory for the opposition team to have a counter plan. Like they may have one, it's not mandatory. So like, for example, I don't know, if the motion is this house would ban gambling, the opposition can say we would not ban it, but we would substantially increase taxes to make it more expensive. And so those who are very poor will be deterred from participating. That is a counter plan. They can bring a counter plan. They're not required to. There was a term that someone mentioned on a question, which I think is a key term, which is fiat. So fiat is obviously that if a motion is phrased in terms of a policy, we have to presuppose that the government has the sufficient economic and political resources to implement that policy. There is another thing called op fiat. What is op fiat? Op fiat is the capacity that opposition teams have to present a counter plan. There are three criteria for op fiat. The first is that they cannot have more economic and political resources than the government. So, for example, if the motion says this house as Mexico would legalize drugs, it would not be plausible for the opening opposition to say, we believe that Mexico should not legalize drugs. What they should do is to end all crime. And we would do it by funding a full regiment of 50,000 robot soldiers that will shoot an enchilada to every single narco. Implemented by opening government. So like, for example, we will not legalize drugs, but rather we will intensify the war on drugs by improving intelligence services and so on. That would be valid. A second thing, obviously, is the counterprop has to exclude the policy. So it can't be a different version of the policy. So like, opening government says that they will legalize drugs. We will legalize drugs and tax them. Obviously, no, because you're also doing opening government's policy. You're just doing a different version of opening government's policy. Thirdly, you cannot presuppose that you will have funding for a very different thing. So like, for example, it is not a valid counterprop to say, we as Mexico would not legalize drugs, and all of the money that opening government would destinate towards drugs legalization, we would dedicate to fighting the pandemic. Yeah, no, because once again, you cannot presuppose that just because the government has more money, that they will necessarily use it in a particular way. You do not have fiat for saying the Mexican government will not spend money on the drug war, and they will use this money in thing X. You do not have fiat for establishing that if you're up. Okay, 617 does not matter. Oh, sorry, my dog went up. What's happening to my dog? This is a disaster. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think we've done enough with multiple choice. My suggestion is that we go to one of the hypothetical case questions. Let's just look at a couple of them. Okay, something really weird is happening with my computer. Give me 1 minute and I'll fix this. Okay. Yeah, okay, this is better. I created a PDF. Okay, yeah, cool. Now we'll check a couple of questions on hypothetical cases. 5. On the motion, this House believes that the Association of Southeast Nations should invite China to become a member. OP pursues the following line. It is far too soon to do this. In the distant future, China dramatically changes its behavior. It might make sense, but in the present and foreseeable future, there are too many conflicts of interest between China and ASEAN states. If fully made, this line is a valid opposition line, which means it should be credited. It doesn't mean that they win. It just means that it should be credited. Thoughts on this question? No?
First, maybe it will be false because in a motion, you assume that this case will work, like you can invite China, but in the beginning of the sentence, they show a problem. There is many conflict.
Sorry, keep going.
Okay, in the beginning, in the end of the sentence, they say that there is a problem in this for both of association and China. There is a problem. So even if it would be capable of inviting China, it would not be good because China has problems with the southern nations. So I think that is true.
Right. Yeah. Yes. So I think one way to contextualize why the answer is true is that all teams have to debate about the present and the foreseeable future. So like a team is not allowed to say, we believe that China should join ASEAN in 150 years. Obviously, they cannot do that. So it is valid to say, look, maybe in the distant future, if things are radically different, it would be fine to join. But in the foreseeable future, like right now, and say in a number of years to come, we do not think that this will happen, because once again, all debates have to happen either on the present or in the near future. So like it is a valid upline to say in the distant future, this may be fine. Okay, now I want to check the intervention one. Okay, yeah. Okay. Question number 3. This is essentially a nightmare debate. On the motion, this House as the European Union would offer membership to Serbia. Opening government argues the proposition is excellent since it removes barriers from Serbian tourists traveling to the European Union. According to our calculation, tourism would grow by 0.01%. Secondly, as soon as we offer the membership, trust will go up by 0.01%. Opening opposition says, given a strong anti-European Union bias in Serbia, Serbia would not accept the offer. CG reads out the motion in a dramatic voice. CO argues that Croatia will veto such a proposal, therefore the offer is not feasible. Thus, logically, all the benefits of the government in this room or any other do not stand. Assume that the teams make the above cases and offer no further considerations. Okay, so opening government beats opening opposition. Who thinks that is correct?
I think it's correct.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So why? Because the opening opposition does not provide us any reason whatsoever for thinking that this is bad. So they just say they will not accept. So what? So like it just means that, okay, you may not get the benefit. It's possible. Fine. It is unclear in which way the world is worse if this happens. While the opening government provides us a very small, minute benefit, but it's still a marginal benefit. So like there is one way in which the world may be better if this happens. And the opening opposition just says, look, there is a chance that perhaps nothing happens. So they just say no. And then nothing happens. So like it seems that from the opening government, there is slightly a marginal benefit. And from the opening opposition, there seems to be no marginal harm. Okay, 2. Opening government beats closing opposition. Correct. Yeah. Why? Because once again, what the closing opposition is saying is they are violating the principle of fiat. They are saying Croatia will veto this, that is disallowed by the rules of debating, because we have to presuppose that the government has the sufficient political and economic resources to pass a certain kind of a certain measure or action or policy. Okay, finally, who thinks that finally, given that the closing opposition also loses to the opening opposition. Why? Because once again, we are trying to compare contributions that are minuscule, and what the opening opposition offers is a very small mitigation. And what the closing opposition offers is essentially nothing. It's just pointing out something that's not permitted by the rules. So like marginally from the opening up, there is some sort of contribution. From the closing opposition, there seems to be no contribution. Yes.
How about CG and CO? How do I compare them?
That's a good question, actually. It seems to me that CO wins over CG because at least they stayed on topic. So that's better. like CG just read a motion. So that seems slightly more persuasive. So like, once again, considering that if teams are literally that terrible, so like if they're literally just saying almost random things, you can defer to criteria that to some extent are subjective. But if teams are not making any sort of effort to explain why their material matters, and if it is so poor as what's explained here, I think it would make sense to say, look, the closing opposition violated the rules, but they at least engage with the clashes. Perhaps the contribution that they made to those clashes was not good. Perhaps it cannot even be counted, but there was still an attempted contribution. And from CG, they just literally read the motion and then sat down. All right. Then finally, let's check the Africa motion. Okay, yeah. Question 8. On the motion, this House would stop giving financial aid to Tanzania, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, and Mozambique. The Prime Minister makes persuasive arguments about cutting aid to Tanzania, Kenya, and Cote d'Ivoire. Leader of opposition opens by, we concede that aid should not be given to Tanzania, Kenya, and Cote d'Ivoire. However, we strongly oppose cutting aid to Mozambique. At the end of the top half, OG clearly wins on whether we should cut aid to Tanzania, Kenya, and Cote d'Ivoire. OO clearly wins in why we should continue aid to Mozambique. Quite easy. Who do we think wins this one?
Opening government?
No. The reason why they don't win is that, so in this case, it is very tricky. So I think the reason why that strategy does not work will become more clear if we take a look at a different motion that has fewer moving parts. So think about the motion. This House would allow euthanasia for blind children. The opening opposition says we would allow euthanasia for children, but not for blind children. In that case, I think it is more intuitive that if the opening government explains correctly that we should allow it for children and euthanasia, but not for blind children, we would conclude that they have failed at their burden, and that even if the opening opposition concedes that euthanasia is fine and euthanasia for children is fine, but if they convince me that specifically giving the right to euthanasia to blind children is bad, I think intuitively we would say, fine, the opening opposition beat the opening government. So in this case, it is similar. So the thing with policy motions and with op fiat is that op teams are not allowed to have a counter prop that does the same as the motion, but they can have a counter prop that does things that are similar but not the same as the motion. So for example, the opposition can say, our counter prop is we would allow euthanasia, and we would allow euthanasia for children, but not euthanasia for blind children. So it is similar, but it excludes one aspect of the motion. This is the same. So what opening government is saying is we would exclude it to 4 countries. The opening opposition is saying we would exclude it to 3. And it is still sufficiently distinct because there is a portion of the policy that they reject, which is we would not stop giving financial aid to Mozambique. Therefore, it is a valid stance for the opening opposition, and they can beat the opening government with that claim. Yes. Your mic is off.
I have two questions. The first question is whether this is a good or a bad motion, because it looks to me that the burden that OG has to prove is way higher than the opposition. Like the opposition can just like pick, like choose what they are going to oppose and what the clashes are going to be. And like, is it a good motion? But besides
it's a terrible motion, very bad motion. Okay.
Oh, thank you. Thank God. And the second question is what a closing opposition will do on this case, because opening opposition conceded that Tanzania, Kenya, and Cote d'Ivoire would be okay. So what are the options for the closing opposition? Because I don't really think they can say, oh, but Tanzania and Kenya and Cote d'Ivoire would be like also bad, because opening opposition claimed that it would be okay. So what are like, so what, like, how do you evaluate a closing opposition? And is there any possible, like, is any other possibility for a closing opposition to win over OO without having to knife them? Or they would have to stick to Mozambique and win Mozambique?
All right, so the straightforward response is no, they would have to stick to Mozambique. Perhaps if they wanted to explore different points, they can bring it as an even if. So like, even if we thought that it was a good idea to do X, then this would still be bad. But I think that in the vast majority of debates in which an opening team makes a concession, the closing team has no choice but to try to figure it out how to extend within the scope of that concession. In this case, that would happen, especially since we think that opening opposition is defeating the opening government. So like, if that's happening, then if closing opposition says, but even if the closing opposition was wrong, this would still happen. The problem is that if your case is based on an even if, and your opening team was winning, it is likely to be less persuasive because your case is bracketing something that they had won. So it's not that persuasive. If your opening team is losing, perhaps the even if case is stronger because you are trying to fill something that it could not do. So like, say your opening team conceded something. They lost by conceding that. And then you say, look, even if we didn't concede this, they would still be wrong. And your response actually works better than your opening. That may be sufficient to beat them because they were losing. So you are engaging at a higher level with the opening government by running the even if claim. But in this case, your opening was winning. So bracketing stuff and saying, let's assume that they didn't say this, will not allow you to beat them, because actually, under the assumptions that they constructed, they beat the opening government. So in this specific case, I think you would have to work within the scope of Mozambique if you wanted to beat the opening opposition.
This also is
but it's a terrible
question
motion
for me. Because like we often do this when we are adjudicating, like, like the closing team solves a deadlock. So when they solve this deadlock, they win over the top half. But the question here is like, it's twofold, because we often say, oh, you can't use CG versus OO to compare with OG. But if you assume that OG doesn't deal with a burden that CG deals with, CG wins over OG, but it's not really a comparative between their houses, it's just like a comparative of burdens and a burden that was asserted by a opposition team. So like,
Right.
how do you explain it without saying that you used like another comparative to show you like, do you see how like how it's tricky?
Yeah. So the way that I would phrase this is comparisons. So like when you compare two teams, you compare the quality of the things they say also on some absolute level. So how does this work? For example, let's say that the opening government brings some responses to the opening opposition, and you think that those responses were not good. And how to figure out that you thought those responses were not good because you concluded that they were losing. So if you conclude that they are losing to the opening opposition, it means that you don't think their responses were that good. If you think the closing government is providing responses that defeat the opening opposition, then that means that those responses are good. So the fact that you think that the opening government did not beat the opening opposition, but the closing government did, indicates you that the quality of responses from the closing government on absolute terms has to be higher than the responses from the opening government, because otherwise it would be impossible for the opening government to lose against the opening opposition and the closing government to beat them. So I think that you should phrase it in terms of that the closing government engaged at a higher level with the than the opening government, because you thought that their content had more nuanced, was better explained, had more thorough framing, and so on. And the fact that you think that, so like the way that you identify this is because you conclude that the responses given by the opening government were insufficient to beat the opening opposition, and the responses given by the closing government were sufficient. So that's how you identify the difference. But the reason why they beat the opening house is not because they beat the opening opposition. That's the way you figure it out. The reason why they beat the opening opposition is because their material was better, which is not the same. So like the reason why they beat the opening opposition and the opening government didn't is because the material from the opening government was weaker and the material from the closing government was stronger. So like one thing is how you come to realize something, and a different thing is the reason why that happened. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So those are the key parts of the test I wanted to cover. So we can have some questions, and if not, then this would be it.
Just before the guys go for the questions, do you guys think that I should stop the live recording so you like maybe you guys feel more free?
Insult people. Yeah, sounds nice. Yeah. Say mean things about people. Sure.